Hey everyone, welcome to this excerpt from the Complete Blender Creator. I'm your main instructor, Michael Bridges. Now, if you want to learn out more, hang around at the end of the video or check out the links in the video description. Enjoy this video.
Welcome to Subsurface Scattering. Now, what is subsurface scattering? Well, it's a node that was recently introduced into Blender that allows us to mimic a certain effect of indirect lighting. So light would penetrate a surface of an object in real life. So whether it's a wax candle, a glass of milk, or even the human skin, light doesn't just hit the surface and bounce off. It actually goes into the surface and scatters within the surface before leaving the skin again. So the light enters the material and then it is scattered in the material by a certain amount depending on certain parameters. Some light leaves the surface at a different point in which it entered. Now, the more the distance that the light travels before exiting, the more it will be absorbed. So you will have less of an effect when it's thick versus when it's thin. So thicker areas will absorb more than thinner ones. Now, most shaders we have used so far are an example of direct surface scattering. So a diffuse shader is how the surface reacts to light. A gloss shader, again, is how the surface reacts to light. Subsurface scattering is a form of indirect surface scattering, where the light enters the material. And to give you a real world example of this, and I'm sure you might have played with a light before, I'll just show you a small clip now of what happens when a simple hand goes over the top of a light source. So here we have a simple light. I'm using my phone light here, and I've got a piece of cardboard. As we approach the actual light itself, this is an example of subsurface scattering. The light is entering that cardboard and actually being bounced about. And if we go and grab my hand, as we start to move towards, you can now see that the fingertip itself is starting to scatter red light. And if I move my finger down across the light, you can see that the light is coming through the finger. In fact, down this gap in between the fingers, it is in fact subsurface scattering again. The light is not getting through directly rather than indirectly through the finger. So before we go ahead and start playing about with the subsurface scattering node, I just want to show you these two scenes. The only difference between these two scenes is the lighting itself. They're just spheres with a subsurface scattering material applied to them. The first one has a 3-point lighting setup. The second one, you can see, is very much extreme. The light is slightly to the right and behind, and it is just a single bright spotlight. And that produces a dramatically different effect. So it's important here when we compare the two images that you realize that lighting can make a big impact to your scene. So it's quite useful to get that right first before you start tweaking your materials, because you could be tweaking your materials based upon the lighting rather than basing it upon what the actual material should be resembling. So now we've explored these particular topics, let's go play with the subsurface scattering node over in Blender. So I've gone ahead and opened up a brand new Blender file. Now there's one important thing that you should know before we get going, is that subsurface scattering is only supported on GPUs from the latest version of Blender, which is currently 2.77. Before that, if you try and use subsurface scattering on your GPU, you will end up with it not rendering. You'll get an error, and what will happen is the render will come out and it'll just be blank. I've just popped over to my PC. In fact, the balls that you've just seen, I rendered on my PC, and I had 2.76 installed on that particular computer, and I had made it on my Mac, went over the PC for rendering, and found that everything was black. It confused me for a few moments until I realized that I was just running an older version where the GPU was not supported for subsurface scattering. The CPU has always been, so that's fine. So if you are finding you're having rendering problems, do make sure you've got the latest version of Blender. So, without any further ado, let's go and delete this cube and add in the monkey. Hello, Suzanne. We're going to then get a subsurface division modifier just to make her a little smoother and add in a smooth shading. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead now and play with the materials. There's a couple of ways that we can obviously get to the materials. We're going to need the node editor in a moment, so let's go ahead and open up the node editor. There we go. And we can create a new material on the node editor or in the materials properties over here. It doesn't matter. And once we've created that, let's zoom in so you guys can see what's going on. And we can see at the moment it's got a diffuse shader. Now, eventually, when we build up the actual layers that exist for the skin, we're going to use a monkey as an example here, we will end up with a diffuse shader, but for the moment, we can just get rid of it. In fact, I didn't want to get rid of everything, just the diffuse shader. So we'll just start with one subsurface scattering shader. So under shaders, we've got subsurface scattering. Now it's sometimes abbreviated to just 3 S's as well. So if you ever see SSS, that means subsurface scattering. And let's turn my viewport to rendered mode. Now we can already see this compared to diffuse is already, we're getting light coming through certain directions. Now I'm not quite sure where my lamp is in the scene, so let's just set up the lighting first. In fact, I'm going to put the light almost directly behind Suzanne, so we can really see the light basically come through the ears. Let's go to the front view, pull that down. Can't really see much here, there we go. And I'm going to make that quite bright. I'm just going to make it 5,000 or something. So let's just check and see what that looks like. Okay, 5,000 is going to be too much. Again, let's whiz around to the front and zoom in and see what's going on. So we're losing all the detail in the ears at 5,000, so that is far too bright. So we can play with this to our heart's content. 2,000 is too high. Let's go down to 500. Okay, that's possibly there. Let's drop it to 300. And we can see that light is coming through the chin as well of Suzanne here, as well as the ears. But I'm happy with that. So I'm going to right-click back on Suzanne so I can see the subsurface scattering. And there are a series of options. There's only one output. But when it comes to subsurface scattering, there's a lot of options. So the first option at the top is the fall off. Now this is how quickly the light falls off as it goes through, and these are just different distributions. Cubic, I believe, falls off quicker than Gaussian, and I would have to look up that one on Wikipedia, but it's approximate, as we can see here, it's an approximation to physically based volume scattering, which is why it's the default setting. The color, well, that's like your base color. And that you can get a texture being plugged into here as well if you wanted to. So we set that to whatever color. That is like your base color for the model itself. So if I go ahead and make that slightly peachy, we can see it's that color. If we go and make that a deeper red, it turns red. The scale, we're going to come back to the scale, but it's basically a multiplier for these next 3 options under radius. If we cast our eyes over to the actual material properties, you'll see it's not collapsed here at all. It's literally just 3 options that you can get to. So the radius we'll come back to in a few moments, because the texture blur will only change things if you've got a texture plugged in here, and normal is for normal maps coming in as well. The reason why this has a purple set there is because it has the 3 values here. Now, with a radius, you'd usually think it was like X, Y, and Z. In this case, it isn't. These are RGB values. So I'm going to set the color back to white for the moment, so we get a good representation. I'm going to make it pure white, so a value of 1 throughout. So what we should find here, and I'm going to adjust them over here so I don't have to keep having that drop down. If I turn the blue channel and the green channel down to 0, we should see that it only scatters red, only red light actually exits the model itself, even though the light coming in is white. And again, if we go ahead and make that 0, then nothing will come through. But if we go and add this one, because it's RGB, this should have green light coming through. Now, it can take a while to actually set these up, and truth be told, you're not just going to be using one node in order to get a realistic material. Those balls we saw earlier were just one node, but our skin is more complex than just one node can do. Now, you can certainly make this into a group and perhaps use it again and again if you wanted to, but in general, you've got to think of your skin as a series of layers. Now, with the subsurface scattering, the way that I would tend to set this up, and it varies from project to project, would be to duplicate the subsurface scattering twice. So then we've got 3 layers. So we're going to call this like deep, this one's sort of medium, and this one's near the surface. Now, with all shaders, we're going to have to use a mix shader to put them all together. And if you think about this, if it's the deepest, will be a dark reddy color where all the blood is. Then we've got sort of like the fatty layer, so we'll make that slightly lighter. And then we've got the surface of the skin. And it will depend on the ethnicity of the character you're doing, but in this case, I'm going to stick with myself. So I'm going to make that quite light, because the surface of the skin in places can actually be quite light. I need to build these up now using some mix shaders, and we also want to add in a diffuse shader along with this being mixed and a gloss shader, because the surface of the skin does have a bit of specularity to it. And of course, that means it's time for a challenge. Okay, I'd like you to create your node setup. So you're going to be linking 3 subsurface shaders representing 3 layers beneath the skin. Then link the final 2 surface layers, a diffuse and gloss shader. So there we've got our indirect and direct scattering. Use Suzanne for practice or your own head, it doesn't matter at this stage. I'm going to be using Suzanne, so if you want to follow along with Suzanne the monkey, that's absolutely fine. And play with your settings until you're happy. Now, don't worry about the gloss shader, because that might make the model look a bit waxy, as if it was made out of a wax, essentially. But we'll be dealing with that shortly. Okay, pause the video and give that a go. Okay, guys, welcome back. Let's go play with these nodes over in Blender. Okay, so just before we start this, I know that if we hop into rendered mode, we've only got one light from the back, and that's not going to be good to work out whether we've got the color right. So I am going to make this window a wee bit bigger for a moment, and let's grab a top view and set some duplicate lights just around here. I'm not going to worry about setting them up any further than that, just to create a 3-point lighting. Let's go to the camera view and move that round, render it out at the end to see what it looks like. Okay, almost there. He fills the frame. Ooh, let's go back ever so slightly. There we go. He definitely fills the frame now. Let's hop into rendered mode and see what that looks like. Okay, there's much more light in there now. I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and start playing with the nodes. So I've selected the monkey's head again because I was still on a lamp. So currently we've only got this subsurface scattering node plugged in. So let's go ahead and add in a mix shader. Plop that in place there. And I'm going to join it here. So then we've got these 2 shaders next to one another. Now what we have got here, if I look at the radius, is it's still a bit funny here. And what you'll find is you'll end up with a very, very noisy image with subsurface scattering if your settings here in the radius, i.e. how far light is being scattered, is completely different to what happens with the actual base color. So we've got a base color of near enough red here. Almost pure red looking at it. It's not quite, but it's almost pure red. Now, we're only scattering green light. So that's not going to work very well. So it's going to end up very noisy. You're basically confusing the system at that point. So, but if we start scattering some more red and less green, because there's no green to scatter, we end up with a cleaner image. And the same will have to be applied down here. So the radius here, I'm going to lower these as we go. Let's go for 0.2 and 0.2. I think the other one was a little bit on the high side actually, or low side even. I'm going to go for 0.3 here. Again, these are all things that we can tweak over and over and over again. We're going to need another mix shader. I'm just going to simply duplicate it and plug in this. Now, this is going to be the topmost layer, and we don't want it scattering that much at all. So I'm going, well, not the very top, but the one just beneath. I'm going to make these values very low. So it's still scattering, but not very much, because that represents the layer just under the skin. Oh, look at that. That's coming together now really well. I'm going to zoom in on the head area, especially those ears, because they're the thinnest part on this particular model, so we can see that coming through. Now, what you're not really getting at the moment, it's there, but not fully, is the detail itself. In fact, the detail is mainly being shown up because of the 3-point lighting system rather than anything else. However, we can help that by adding the first surface layer. So let's go ahead and add in a diffuse. And we're going to need another mix shader, and we'll worry about other things like the values of all of this. And we've got a color white here. That's going to be too bright. I'm going to actually lower it down to roughly what I'd have on for my skin. That's just a rough guess there. Of course, depending on the ethnicity of whatever you're making, you can pick any color you want. Hey, you can have an alien one if you wanted and color him in green. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that rough color that I've got here. So now we start to see some more detail. In fact, if I whack this all the way up here, then we've got a full diffuse shader, and we can lower that back down and just have just the subscattering. Of course, we want a mix of everything as we go through. Now, this first layer here, we definitely want more of the base layer coming through. Well, I think we do. I'm going to play with it a bit. There we go. The ears have gone just that little bit redder because they're the thinnest part. Not so much of this coming through. We do want some of the diffuse. I'm going to take that up to maybe around 40% or so. And then we need the final layer. So we're going to need yet another mix shader. So I'm going to duplicate that and add in a gloss shader. Now this will obviously add highlights to our model. And if we go all the way, we end up with a very shiny surface, and we go all the way back, it ends up fully whatever this area is here. So it's a mixture of the diffuse and the subsurface scattering nodes. So I'm going to bring that up to around 15 to 20%, just so we start getting highlights. Now, this is what I mean by it starts to look a bit plasticky or a bit waxy. We can certainly increase the roughness. If the roughness is too low, it's just going to look, well, very, very shiny. If it's too high, we're going to lose some of that detail in highlights. So I'm going to set it to about 0.3, so we've got some subtle highlights there. But we're going to deal with the positioning of those highlights. There's plenty of ways of doing it, but not in this particular setup. So let's just hit the render key and see what this looks like when it's rendered out. I've not got it set particularly high on samples. In fact, I don't know what I've got it set to. It's set to 50 samples at the moment. I'm quite happy with that. It's a bit pink, so I could go back. Oh, not here. I want to go back to the node editor. It's probably this diffuse color here that's bringing that out. So if I make that a bit lighter, and of course, I'm going to really ramp the samples up now. 300 is too high. That's just silly at this stage. I'm going to go to 200 just to get a temporary feel of how this is looking. I wouldn't ever recommend rendering at high samples just for your test renders. I mean, 200 is not particularly high, but it's not low either. You can see this is, well, it was at 50, it's now 200. It's going to take 4 times longer than it did before, and we can check that because our last render was just over 8 seconds, so I reckon this one's going to be around 30, around there anyway. So it's just finishing off here. There we go, 32, not bad. Well, 8 times 4 is 32, so there we go. So that is looking pretty good. I'm impressed with that. How are you guys getting on? Did you do this with Suzanne, or did you decide to start going on straight away with your head that you've been working on? I suggest if you haven't done that, you go and apply the knowledge you've just learned immediately by applying this sort of setup and play with it to your particular head model that you're working on. As always, share in the discussions, and I will see you in the next lecture.
Hey, so I hope you've enjoyed that excerpt from the Complete Blender Creator. It's part of a much larger course incorporating 46 hours worth of Blender learning, where we hold your hand from a very beginner all the way up to mastering the techniques deep within Blender. Now, if you want to learn more about Blender, this is the course for you, and we've got many other courses as well. So why don't you start your free trial today, and I will see you over on the course.